Hello everyone and welcome to the next virtual lesson. This one is all about blood vessels, and the reason that the background picture here is a set of roads is for you to start to think about the blood vessels as transport systems. So think about how a road gets goods from one place to another. So if you've ordered a PlayStation or some mascara or whatever it is on the internet, it comes from a factory and it gets delivered in a truck and it gets transported from one place to another. Now in our body, because we're multicellular and made up of loads and loads of cells, we need blood vessels to act a little bit like the roads in our body to transport substances from one place to another. Let's have a recap from last time. So in the last video we looked specifically at blood, and we talked about how blood transports materials around the body and protects against disease. It consists of cells, solutes and liquids. And when we look at the composition of blood, we can see that it's 55% plasma, 45% red blood cells, and just less than 1% is white blood cells and platelets. Remember that all of these figures are rounded up, which is why it adds up to 101%. And if all of these words mean absolutely nothing to you, then I'd suggest stopping the video here and going back and looking at the last video on blood, where we talk more about what all those parts are. We're going to do a recap first. So I want you to pause the video and write down your answers to these 6 questions. So the parts that make up the blood are plasma, red blood cells, white blood cells and platelets. And the parts of blood that are used to transport substances are plasma and red blood cells transporting oxygen and plasma transporting hormones and nutrients and all the dissolved things in our blood. And our red blood cells contain hemoglobin, and if you remember from the last video, that combines with oxygen to make oxyhemoglobin. Scabs are made from platelets, and platelets are just broken bits of cell that help to form a kind of like a stopper at the site of a wound. So when you cut yourself, rather than you bleeding to death, they kind of plug the wound. So a little bit like if you've got a bath and you take the plug out, all that water rushes out, but if you put your hand over it, you prevent that water coming out. And your platelets kind of do that. They make a plug or a barrier to stop you losing all your blood. Why do red blood cells have no nucleus? Well, it gives them more space to hold hemoglobin, which then combines with oxygen, which we talked about a little bit earlier on. And why does a white blood cell need to change shape? For phagocytosis, which is where it engulfs a pathogen and then destroys it with digestive enzymes. Blood vessels range from almost 1 centimetre in diameter, which is pretty tiny, to a fraction of a millimetre, which is really tiny. There are over 60,000 miles of blood vessels in the human body, and to put that into perspective, to travel from London to New York is around about 3,500 miles, so you'd have to make that trip an awful lot to even get close to the amount of distance your vessels would take up if we laid them all end to end, which is a horrible thought. Don't do that. An average human has 5 litres of blood circulating around the body, and when you donate blood, they only take around half a litre. So in the previous videos about blood, we said that it's around about 4 to 6 litres, so 5 would be the average in the body, and yeah, pints are nothing when it gets replenished relatively quickly. Now there's 3 types of blood vessel. The arteries, and the arteries carry blood away from the heart, and of course you can remember that because A for arteries, A for away. The capillaries carry blood close to all your cells and tissues. Again, you can remember that for C for capillaries, C for cells. And finally, your veins carry blood towards the heart. Now, I didn't have a way to remember this, but if you imagine that the W is 2 V's, kind of, that could be a way to remember it. So it carries blood towards the heart. So what I'd like you to do here is to pause the video and to do me a rough sketch of the 3 blood vessels. You can add the labels if you want to, or you can just add annotations throughout the video and pause it when you feel there's something useful you want to include. Let's talk about the arteries first. Arteries carry blood under high pressure. They have thick, muscular walls, and the walls stretch when the heart beats and then contract back and force the blood forwards. And this can be felt as your pulse, which is why you can feel your pulse in certain areas of your body, like your neck, because you're feeling the walls of your arteries stretch, feeling them contract. So if someone has been in an accident and they're bleeding, how could you tell just by looking if an artery's been damaged? And just as important, if it was a damaged artery, what would you do? Blood in the arteries is under pressure and in a muscular elastic tube. So blood squirts out because it's driven by the heartbeat and the pulse. So because your heartbeat is pushing and pushing the blood through your arteries, it's going to keep squirting out of your body if you've cut an artery. So to seal the wound, pressure must be applied, and if possible, you should lift the wound site up, which is why you sometimes in first aid courses see things where you would lift the arm or lift the injured area up if possible. Gravity will help to slow the amount of blood being pushed out. So just to recap, the arteries carry blood away from the heart and they're under high pressure. They carry oxygenated blood, so that's where the oxygen has been enriched from the lungs. So gas exchange has happened in the lungs and filled the blood cells with those oxygen on the hemoglobin. They have a really small lumen. A lumen is just a fancy word for the hole in the middle of the artery. And I always think of it like you're putting your thumb over the top of a hose, and when it squirts everywhere, because you've narrowed the area where that water is able to come out. So it's under a lot of pressure. And there's no valves involved, so it's just one kind of tube that flows around, remember, away from the heart, full of oxygen and under high pressure. Capillaries are very, very narrow and they force blood cells to pass in a single file. You can see that on the diagram on the left. Capillaries have very thin walls, about 1 cell thick, which makes it very easy to transfer substances. If you remember, things like glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide diffuse in and out of cells, and that's because our capillaries go to all our cells and tissues. They surround organs such as the lungs, in particular the alveoli of our lungs, which give it a really high concentration gradient, meaning diffusion happens really quickly. The capillaries are the point where arteries become veins. They kind of connect them together. And when you fall and graze your elbow, the blood oozes out. You've damaged a few capillaries. A small skin cut doesn't bleed much for the same reason, and that's because the platelets, linking back to the other video, help to stop the bleeding. So when you cut the surface of your skin, you're not doing any major damage, you're damaging capillaries. Arteries are obviously a life-threatening thing to damage. So capillaries penetrate all tissues and cells. They're very narrow, only 1 cell wide, and they have 1 cell thick walls, which allows the transport of oxygen and nutrients into body cells and waste out to cells through things like diffusion. And it happens really quickly because those cells are so small, so there's less of a distance for diffusion to travel. Veins carry blood towards the heart under low pressure. If you remember, the arteries are under really high pressure because your heart is pumping it really quickly away. Whereas when it's travelled around your body, it's kind of lost some of that initial push. And it's going also against the force of gravity because it's usually going back up. They have a very thin muscular wall, and it's also an elastic wall, so it's able to move a little bit like the artery. The veins have valves which prevent blood flowing backwards. I like to compare this to a cat flap. Think about a one-way cat flap where it might let your cat back in the house but not out. So it's a one-way system. Now when valves get leaky, it can cause varicose veins, which you can see there on the picture, which is where those valves have backflowed. So it does happen, but the idea of the valves is they're supposed to stop it from happening. To recap, veins carry blood towards the heart under low pressure, and they carry deoxygenated blood. So the arteries have collected the blood that's been to the lungs, and the veins are transporting it back to get oxygenated. And you can see on the picture that the veins got a really large and a large hole compared to the artery, which is why it's under low pressure. So thinking back to the hose pipe, you've not put your finger over the end of the hose pipe. It's allowed to just flow as normal. So we're going to do a progress check here. There's 4 questions. I'd like to pause the video and try and answer them for me. Okay, so the 3 types of blood vessel are an artery, vein and capillary. Obviously you can have those in any order. The direction that arteries carry blood is away from the heart and veins carry blood towards the heart. The capillaries have very thin walls to penetrate all cells and tissues. There's a microscope slide here of a vein and an artery, and you can just see the difference of the lumen there, how much bigger the whole of the vein is and how much smaller the artery vein is. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video and to copy this table down. Don't worry about what you're doing yet, just copy the table down. Okay, what I'd like you to do is to complete the table and explain how each of the blood vessels is adapted for its role. So the artery's job is to carry high pressure blood that's full of oxygen away from the heart towards the body. It's got a really small lumen to maintain that pressure, and a smooth muscle wall is thick to make it more elastic and to maintain pressure as well. It doesn't have valves and the outer walls are quite elastic. The vein is under much lower pressure and it carries the deoxygenated blood from the body towards the heart. It's wider to help assist in the flow. It's got a thinner muscular wall. It's got valves to prevent backflow, and the walls are also elastic. So the capillary carries nutrients or gases to tissues and helps to remove waste products. The lumen is super tiny as the blood vessel's tiny. Think to what we were saying where the blood cells travel one by one through the capillary, so it's a really, really tiny hole. They're not made of smooth muscle and they don't have valves. And the outer walls are a single cell thick to allow nutrients and gases to diffuse through much quicker. So that brings us to the end of our lesson on blood vessels. So we have the artery with its thick, muscular and elastic wall and its small lumen to maintain pressure, carrying blood away from the heart. You have the vein, which has valves in it to help stop backflow. It's under much lower pressure and it's got a thinner elastic wall. And your capillary, which is really, really tiny and the walls are 1 cell thick. So if you need to, rewatch the video, or you can rewatch the last video on blood, and the next one is going to be on the heart. Thank you for watching.